I'm very grateful for the honor of this prize. It's a link to previous prize winners, all fine social scientists and some close friends, and a link also to the great Vasily Leontief. Some people wrongly dismiss his huge contribution, which is input-output analysis, as linear economics with no response to prices. But he in fact addressed these criticisms with a dual price model. And in his Nobel autobiography, he described his, quote, use of a large-scale mechanical computing machine in 1935 and Mark I, the first large-scale electronic computer, in 1943, unquote. This paved the way for input-output to morph into modern general equilibrium models of the type that Peter has described from the 1970s. Leontief was also a lifelong public intellectual, from protesting against repression at Leningrad University in 1921 to modeling population, quote, environmental disruption and growth, unquote, after 1970. Now this talk is called Maintaining, and indeed one should add increasing income from work, the resource food population crisis in the short Africa. Now by the short Africa, I mean Africa minus Northern Africa, Sudan, Madagascar, Mauritius, and South Africa. All are sharply distinct from the rest of Africa in environments, agricultures, economics, poverty reduction, and demographics. The short Africa is, of course, regionally diverse, but not more so than is India or China, which have enormous internal differences too. Second, crisis I use as a standard medical sense of a turning point for better or worse. Much talk of Africa bemoans stagnation or trumpets renaissance. Africa faces neither. From now to 2050, as population and environment change, Africans face a crisis of the ability to get income from work. That will get far better or far worse. Between 1950 and today, population in the short Africa rose 5 times. It will more than double again by 2050, and in 2050, the short Africa will have a population 11.3 times its 1950 level. People of prime working age, that's 15 to 64, are increasing faster still as more children survive into adulthood and fertility falls. In 1985, the short Africa had 106 people of prime working age, 15 to 64, for every 100 dependents. Today there are 120, and the UN middle projection for 2050 is 196. Now in South and East Asia in 1965 to 2000, a similar rise in workers per dependent gave what's called a demographic dividend, and that contributed about 1/3 to the Asian growth miracle, having more workers per head of population. It also contributed massively to poverty reduction. But that was because the extra workers found productive employment, first in small holdings, which gained from a green revolution, and often from land reform too, and later, as farm transformation released workers and food, new workplaces came from industry and services instead, but only because agriculture had done the first step of that. Now again, to get you some idea of the numbers, between 2012 and 2050, there are going to be 3.5% more workers aged 15 to 64 each year in the short Africa, the heart of Sub-Saharan Africa. Will these swelling ranks, especially of young workers, produce African miracles, as like the Asian miracles, or worsening poverty, unemployment, violence, and unrest? That is the crisis. I believe farming and the future of smallholding in particular will decide in Africa as it did in Asia. Farms remain the main income and work source for more than 2 in 3 people in the short Africa, and among the young and the poor, it's even more. This will change, but slowly. Official data for rural to urban migration and projections of the urban share in Africa are huge overestimates. Neither mines nor manufacturing have offered many workplaces, especially to the unskilled poor. Within farming, small holdings, up to 1 or 2 hectares, are central for 2 reasons. First, they support the vast majority of farm people in Africa and will long do so. Second, on a mass of evidence, small farms are efficient resource users, are keen though risk-averse innovators, and in developing countries, where farms rely more on supervised family labor than they do on physical capital and machinery, small farms get more output per hectare and provide far more employment and labor income per hectare than do large farms. Africa was once a continent of spare land, but it is rapidly running out of land. Much of it has done already, so that small farmers' higher output per hectare is absolutely crucial. Small farmers need intermediation to get their goods to market, particularly to supermarkets and for horticulture exports, and to get processing done. But once the small farmer has enough to sell, intermediation of that sort usually works in Africa and worldwide. Now let's see what these small guys can do, usually small women. In 1977 to 84, China reformed land from a commune system into over 100 million fairly equal family holdings, mostly below half a hectare. These used water control, fertilizers, and better seeds to raise the output of main crops, rice, wheat, and maize, by over 6% per year for 6 years. It went on rising after that, too. Peter Timmer analyzed and helped a comparable transformation later in Indonesia. Much of India, Bangladesh, and other parts of Asia also did very well through smallholder-based productivity growth. Some groups and areas were left out, but transformation spread far beyond the innovators and far beyond the best lands that led the process. Asia's demographics also improved sooner and faster than Africa's. Child mortality fell faster, and this is the prime mover that lowers fertility, and lowers fertility more than mortality, so that your lowers fertility more than mortality, so that your rate of population growth starts to fall. Now, if we went back to 1950, if you look at Benjamin Higgins' original textbook, Economic Development, most observers agreed that South and East Asia, near the land frontier, had been dealt a much worse demographic and resource hand than had Sub-Saharan Africa. But in 1965 to 2000, Asia showed that smallholders can lead transformation within agriculture and hence enable later transition out of agriculture. But there are conditions. Public infrastructure going far beyond the conventional concept of public goods, and public commitment. Applied farm science, some limits through land reform if necessary on land inequality, and firms and social capital helping smallholders to process, cooperate, and liaise with expanding or globalizing markets. We all know about the elephant in the room, that boring creature, but there is also an elephant in the Asian miracle. And the elephant in the miracle is prior Green Revolution and often land reform leading to smallholder-initiated and smallholder-sustained economic takeoff. African rural areas have suffered decades of policy neglect and also of extraction, both from farmers and from soil water resources. So Africa faces harsher problems in resolving the demography resource crisis than Asia did. To produce more, let alone to do so sustainably, farmers need enough land, water, and soil nutrients, and if you take those out in production, you need to put them back through fertilizers and through water maintenance. In the short Africa, fewer than 6 kilograms per hectare of main plant nutrients, nitrogen, potash, phosphorus, are being added with fertilizer. If we go back to Asia, South and East Asia, when the Green Revolution started, it was about 100 kilograms per hectare, and today it's about 170 kilograms per hectare. Now, why is Africa applying so little fertilizer? Not because the farmers don't know about it, but because if you haven't got reliable water, fertilizers don't provide very much extra income. And less than 1% of all cropland in the short Africa is irrigated. At the start of Asia's Green Revolution, South and East Asia, it was about 28%, and now it's about 37%. So you have a lack of the basic water security, and farmers are thus reluctant to apply fertilizer. Now, there have been African farm successes, a number of agronomic advances, water retention in Burkina, for example, in soil pots. There has been substantial success with hybrid maize, first in Zimbabwe, then elsewhere. New cassava and rice varieties in West Africa, I think somewhat overhyped, but nevertheless certainly something happening. Malawi's use of fertilizer subsidy, intelligently designed to increase fertilizer offtake. National input delivery pilots through the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. Many aspects of farm output expansion in Ghana. Regional land water development in the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Programme, though very slow to get underway. A lot of promising things going on, but they are spotty compared with what Asia has experienced. And widespread fast yield growth without large amounts of fertilizer and water control is like asking people to make bricks without straw. You may ask then, without rapid growth of food staples yield, how have people in the short Africa, 5 times more now than they were in 1950, how on earth have they survived? How have they got a basic minimum of work for income and food? Mainly by land expansion. But that was not enough. The proportion of people in dollar-a-day poverty in Sub-Saharan Africa has stagnated at about 50%. This is extreme poverty, and these are quite good numbers, between 1980 and today, while poverty has fallen sharply everywhere else in the developing world. Data for output of food staples in Sub-Saharan Africa are horrendously weak, but there are decent data for food trade, especially staples trade, and for nutrition. And these data imply that calorie output and intake per person, averaged across research sites in the short Africa, remain as deficient in both output and intake of calories as they were in the early 1960s. Farmers' strategy of feeding themselves by land expansion alone not only didn't do more than barely maintain living standards, it's unsustainable in most of Africa. Farmland expansion is inducing soil depletion that in many cases means net loss of farmland. Land expansion has spread soil-exhausting, largely unfertilized crops, mainly maize, into lands that without fertilizers or irrigation can sustain only extensive grazing. Already in 2002-3, 40% of farmland in Sub-Saharan Africa was losing more than 60 kilograms per hectare of the main plant nutrients NPK. That's not sustainable for very long. 95 million hectares were severely depleted of soil nutrients, and it's worse now than it was in 2002-3. So the idea that Africa's problems can be solved by massive land expansion is, I'm afraid, a pipe dream. We've seen what it does to sustainability. It needs to be sustainable intensification. Now, is the short Africa's farm water position also critical? Only a few countries in the Horn of Africa and the Sudan-Sahel face aggregate physical water stress. Yet, I think that is to over-aggregate, and in most countries, farmers face economic water stress. Lacking irrigation, they cannot get or buy water at some crucial crop time, and more crops are dying for lack of water, more staples, a larger proportion. I would guess, if one could check this, I hypothesize, a larger proportion dying for lack of water in the short Africa than in any other region. Meanwhile, global warming obviously boosts the evaporation and transpiration rate at the hottest and thirstiest time for crops and makes rainfall amount and timing less reliable. Now in Asia and in Northern Africa and indeed in South Africa, many farmers got irrigation early, helping them to generate a green revolution. In the short Africa, the farmer must fight vociferous and growing cities, mines and industries for irrigation water that she does not yet have. There is very, very little irrigation yet going there. So the short Africa's swelling young workforce its stubbornly low yields of food staples, its threatened soil water base, all these faced South and East Asia too in 1965. Like all crises, these offer then and now not only risks of disaster, but also, as Asia showed, great opportunities too. As Gerschenkron, who's been referred to already, showed, latecomers can go for quick catch-up, not to big capital-intensive farms, absolutely right in America, but wrong, disastrous, entirely against the factor scarcities in Sub-Saharan Africa. But big catch-up to skilled, smallholder, science-based intensification, controlled water, new seeds, emphatically including transgenics, biotechnology-based seeds, and the careful and economic application of greatly increased amounts of fertilizer. Farms like that prevail in most of Africa, in most of Asia, not with transgenics yet, and in some of Sub-Saharan Africa too. But past failures show that smallholder-led development in Sub-Saharan Africa is no easy option. How might Africa get a good outcome to its crisis of income from work? This crisis of very sharply rising more numbers of workers, no possibility in most places of greatly increasing the land frontier. So either things are going to get sharply better, new ways of doing things are going to be found, or they're going to get sharply worse. How can Africa get a good outcome to its crisis? I suggest that three things would help. One, stop kidding ourselves that the problem is being solved, that there is a renaissance, or can be solved without mass smallholder yield growth. Two, give smallholders public respect and their infrastructures a fair share of public resources. Three, set agriculture into a context of policy for resources, demography, and food. I'll say a little about each of those. One, stop kidding ourselves. The newspapers are full of investment bonanzas, and Africa largely accelerating at 5% a year since the year 2000 and projected to continue. These numbers are pretty worthless. First of all, even if the numbers were not worthless, they are numbers for growth of gross domestic product, including minerals income, much of it accruing to foreigners, and very little going to citizens, especially poor citizens. It's not retained national income, it's gross domestic product. Mining first depletes capital, and the World Bank study, Where is the Wealth of Nations, shows that most mineral economies in Sub-Saharan Africa are depleting capital more than their low domestic savings rates are able to make it good. Mining first also employs few, pumps up corruption, and sucks incentives and resources away from other activity, including agriculture. Manufacturing first does have small islands of success in Africa, such as Ghana, such as Mauritius, but can seldom compete with, say, Vietnam or Bangladesh on unit labor costs or skill levels. Okay, let's look back to agriculture. Staples yields. Peter looked at the trends 10 years ago, and they were pretty dismal. And staples yields, on the whole, have not reversed those trends. Big rises do typify some small African countries, Rwanda, perhaps Burkina. But the populous ones, especially DR Congo, Ethiopia, and despite some funny numbers, Nigeria, tell a sad tale. Shifts of land to capital-intensive big farms, land grab, quote, raise labor productivity. They do for the few who stay at work on such farms. But as the capital drives out and displaces the labor driven out finds it has lower productivity, less work, and lower income. They are pushed off the land before non-farming is ready to absorb them, and almost all the history of African farming shows that these large farms are not as socially efficient resource users as small farmers are. Now, expanding into new farmland. Ghana was a brilliant exception. It did achieve a lot through farmland expansion, but it's got near the frontier. We've heard recent talk of the Guinea savanna as a sleeping giant. We're talking about 400 million hectares. Now, most of those are farmed already, but some of them are supposed to be. A lot of them are supposed to be areas for land expansion. If such huge land resources existed in 20 countries, then their people, most under tightening land pressure for 60 years, would have farmed them long ago. I contend that most of Africa has very little good, empty, cheaply breakable cropland. Indeed, sustainability requires less cropping, not more, in currently marginal areas. So smallholder-based yield growth is a necessary preliminary for development, and we better start asking ourselves how we get it instead of looking for wonderful opportunities in the undergrowth somewhere. 2, stop denigrating smallholders. If you listen to many African politicians and many economists, European, American, and African working in Africa, you will hear them bombard smallholders with insults. Subsistence, sub-subsistence, scratch-a-patch, marginal farmers, deficit farmers, sub-family farmers, all in damning contrast to commercial farms. Yet the great majority of these people, mostly women, are commercial. They buy inputs, they sell outputs, they respond to incentives, and they make at least as good a use of resources, getting more output per hectare than big farms. And that is why land in Africa, as in Asia, has been shifting towards smaller farm units. Yet smallholders are dismissed as old, almost all of them are women, they didn't make it in the towns, they need replacement by a few big farms and machines, and anyway, the children don't want to farm. Let me take that up. In India's Punjab in 1967, the children right at the beginning of 1967 didn't want to farm. I saw this transformed as fertilizers, tube wells, and semi-dwarf varieties of wheat and rice made it highly profitable to farm, and young government and factory workers, unskilled workers, scrambled home from Delhi because they could make good profit in the Punjab on even half a hectare. If young Africans don't want to farm, it's because the powers that be disrespect and under-resource smallholdings so that they cannot be scientific or reliable. In Asia around 1965, around 20% of public expenditure went to agriculture, employing roughly 2/3 of the population. In the short Africa, with a similar share of the population in agriculture, less than 8% of government expenditure goes to agriculture. Smallholders need policies, not homilies. Respect, land, water, seed research, seed science, extension, fertilizer access, infrastructure, market facilitation. 3, set farms in a demographic land, soil, water context. One policy for one crisis. For a good outcome to this crisis, population growth must fall more sharply as it did in Asia. Fertility decline has been slow in Sub-Saharan Africa, especially in rural areas, mainly because child mortality has improved later and more slowly. For a good crisis, i.e. a resource-sustainable transition to fast work income generating farm growth, green revolutions need complementary policies for slower population growth. And paradoxically, that means first slashing child mortality, then maximizing fertility response by enhanced female education, better opportunities for women as alternatives to motherhood, and wider access to modern contraception. Sustainability must be pre-screened, especially the soil-water impacts reviewed in all policies. Irrigation, better water control and fertilizers can support sustainability by adding the resources that cultivation removes, but they can also create new sustainability issues: salinity, nitrates in drinking water, stealing the water table and not recharging properly so that it becomes unsustainable to supply water through tube wells. These are all risks. Better use efficiency of fertilizers and better use efficiency of farm water are needed too, with water getting scarcer with global warming and less reliable. And with the price of energy going up, we can't just replicate the green revolution in Sub-Saharan Africa. It's essential for water use and fertilizer use to get more efficient. But smallholders are extremely well placed to do that, because smallholders, with their large availability of labor, are well placed, for example, to do split dressings of fertilizer, to get plant water through drip irrigation direct to the root zone. If you have to supervise every smallholder over a farm of 1 square mile, those things are very much less feasible. But for smallholders to do that, they need a choice of fertilizer, not one fertilizer compound supplied by either the state or some private supplier licensed and facilitated by the state. They need a choice of fertilizers, and they need to know the nutrient needs of their plot locally. In other words, you need a considerable public sector information and science infrastructure to support this sort of small farm development. Politicians at top level need to integrate one sustainable policy for all aspects of the crisis in productive labour income: agriculture, food, child nutrition and mortality, reduced fertility, ecology, land, soil, water. Now, this is not a mad planner's dream. Most of it works through markets. In agriculture, most policies will involve correcting incentives, for example, so that people bear the external downstream costs of their water use. But much of it will involve providing infrastructure beyond the normal concept of a public good: irrigation services, rural roads, agricultural research, and yes, the much maligned and essential extension. And in some cases in Eastern and Southern Africa, it will require reforming away current gross inequalities in land access. Professionals who know the evidence agree that small farm-led growth and poverty reduction, while hard, are efficient, normal paths to development and poverty reduction. It's become fashionable to dismiss this as new conventional wisdom, as outdated by new evidence, dangers, or opportunities. In fact, smallholder-led African development is not conventional wisdom. It remains a minority taste. Yes, it's backed by African organizations like the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, and backed, though with more words than cash, by the World Bank. But it has never been accepted by powerful non-experts. The efficiency of smallholding has never been accepted by macroeconomists who are not specialized in agriculture, or by urban interests, or by big farmers themselves, or by politicians taking bribes to let in land grabbers. It's never been accepted by nationalists, and it's never been accepted by determinist politicians of left and right, who see small farming as a dustbin of history for the backward only. Recently, I heard a leading professor of economics say twice in a 3-minute talk that small farmers are inefficient, and once that they can't grow much food. Obviously never been to China. That is the conventional wisdom. And as usual, the conventional wisdom ignores the evidence. Scientific smallholder intensification in Africa is no easy path to development. From global evidence and some African evidence, we know it's possible. But is it necessary? Are there other things that can be done? Initially, yes. Farm development is only the start of modernization, which will take economies eventually away from agriculture. I'm no agricultural or smallholder fundamentalist and never have been. But I am an income from work fundamentalist. The poor must be able to work themselves out of poverty. The short Africa by 2050 will have 3.7 times as many people in the working ages 15 to 64 as it has today. They need an affordable initial path to workplaces that give income and respect. Otherwise, potential demographic dividend will become demographic disaster of unemployment and revolt. But with half the people still in severe poverty and states fiscally cash-strapped too, what initial path is affordable in terms of costs per job? One, trodden elsewhere than in Sub-Saharan Africa, is scientific intensification of smallholder farming. If there's an alternative, I shall be very interested to hear what it is.